Behind the grand narratives of World War II lies a story that history books often leave in the shadows. While we know about the battles, the strategies, and the political machinations, there's another dimension to this war that remains largely untold. In September 1943, when Italy surrendered to the Allied forces, the nightmare for Italian women was just beginning. What happened next would shatter families, destroy communities, and leave scars that would last for generations. From the mountains of the north to the villages of the south, Italian women faced horrors that went far beyond the typical hardships of war. The systematic violence, the calculated cruelty, and the sheer scale of what they endured reveals a darker chapter of World War II that deserves to be remembered. Today, we're going to uncover these forgotten stories, examine the testimonies that survivors courageously shared, and understand how an entire generation of Italian women became victims of a war that consumed everything in its path. September 8, 1943, Marshal Pietro Badoglio announced Italy's surrender to the Allied forces over the radio. What should have been the beginning of peace became the catalyst for unprecedented chaos. Within hours, the Italian army dissolved, leaving the country defensively naked and politically fractured. German forces, once allies, now became occupiers with a vengeance. The Wehrmacht and SS divisions poured into Italian territory with a clear mandate: maintain control at any cost. But it wasn't just military installations they targeted. The German High Command issued directives that would fundamentally change how warfare was conducted on Italian soil. In the small town of Sant'Anna di Stazzema in Tuscany, the morning of August 12, 1944, began like any other. Women were preparing breakfast for their families, children were playing in the narrow cobblestone streets, and elderly residents sat in the shade discussing the war that seemed so distant from their mountain village. Maria Grazia Bertuccelli was 18 years old, helping her mother tend to their small garden when she heard the sound of boots on stone. German soldiers were surrounding the village, cutting off all escape routes. What happened next would become one of the most documented atrocities committed against Italian civilians during the war. The soldiers went door to door, systematically rounding up residents. Women were separated from men, children from their parents. The pattern was deliberate, calculated, and terrifyingly efficient. Anna Pardini, then 23, watched as soldiers forced her neighbors into the village square. She managed to hide in a cellar with her infant daughter, listening to the chaos unfolding above. The massacre that followed lasted for hours. Soldiers moved methodically through the village, executing families in their homes, setting buildings ablaze with people still inside. Women who tried to protect their children were beaten unconscious. Those who pleaded for mercy were ignored, or worse. By evening, 560 civilians lay dead in Sant'Anna di Stazzema. Among them were 130 children under the age of 10 and 316 women. The youngest victim was 20 days old. The oldest was 84. The village that had stood for centuries was reduced to ash and silence. But Sant'Anna di Stazzema was not an isolated incident. It was part of a broader campaign of terror that would sweep across Italy, targeting civilian populations with unprecedented brutality. And women, who made up the majority of those left behind after military-age men had fled or been conscripted, bore the heaviest burden of this systematic violence. What made these attacks particularly horrifying was their calculated nature. This wasn't the chaos of battle or the fog of war. This was deliberate, planned, and executed with military precision. The German forces had specific orders regarding how to treat Italian civilians, and those orders would lead to some of the darkest chapters in the history of warfare. The pattern established at Sant'Anna di Stazzema would be repeated across Italy, but the methods would become increasingly sophisticated and the cruelty more targeted. As we'll discover, what happened in the months following Italy's surrender would test the limits of human endurance and reveal the true cost of war on those least able to defend themselves. The German occupation of Italy was not simply a military operation. It was a comprehensive campaign designed to crush the Italian spirit through the systematic targeting of its most vulnerable populations. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, commander of German forces in Italy, issued directives that would fundamentally alter the nature of the conflict. These orders, discovered in Wehrmacht archives after the war, explicitly authorized the use of extreme measures against Italian civilians suspected of supporting partisan activities. But the definition of support was so broad that virtually any Italian woman could be targeted. Providing food to someone who might be a partisan, failing to report suspicious activity, or simply being related to someone who had joined the resistance, all became capital offenses. In the mountainous regions of northern Italy, where partisan activity was most intense, German forces implemented what they called anti-partisan operations. These weren't military engagements in any traditional sense. They were systematic raids on civilian populations, designed to create such terror that local communities would cease all support for resistance fighters. The village of Marzabotto, nestled in the Apennine Mountains south of Bologna, became the testing ground for these new tactics. On September 29, 1944, SS Sturmbannführer Walter Rieder arrived with the 16th SS Panzergrenadier Division. His orders were clear: eliminate all partisan support in the region through whatever means necessary. Elena Ruggieri was 26 years old, a mother of 3 young children, when the Germans surrounded Marzabotto. She had sent her husband into the mountains weeks earlier, when rumors of the approaching SS division reached their village. Like hundreds of other women, she remained behind with her children, believing that their presence would protect the family from the worst of the German reprisals. The operation that followed was methodical in its cruelty. German soldiers moved through the mountainous terrain, village by village, valley by valley. They were not looking for partisan fighters. They were targeting the infrastructure that made resistance possible. And that infrastructure, in their minds, included every civilian who might provide aid, comfort, or information to the partisans. Over the course of 7 days, between September 29th and October 5th, 1944, SS forces systematically destroyed every settlement in the region. They burned 815 buildings to the ground, killed 1,830 civilians, and left the entire mountainous area uninhabitable. Among the dead were 316 children under the age of 10 and 742 women. The methods used at Marzabotto became the template for similar operations across northern Italy. Villages were surrounded at dawn, when most residents were still sleeping. Soldiers would move door to door, forcing families into central locations, usually the village square or the local church. Then came the selections. Women were routinely subjected to interrogations about their male relatives. Where was her husband? Her sons? Her brothers? Had she seen any partisans? Had she provided food or shelter to anyone suspicious? The questions were designed to trap women in contradictions, providing justification for the violence that would follow, regardless of their answers. At Civitella in Valdichiana, on June 29, 1944, German forces implemented a particularly cruel variation of these tactics. After surrounding the village, they announced that they were looking for specific partisan fighters who had attacked a German patrol the previous week. They demanded that the villagers surrender these men, threatening collective punishment if their demands were not met. When no one came forward, the partisans had long since fled to the mountains. The German commander ordered the execution of every male over the age of 16. But first, they forced the women and children to watch. Mothers were made to stand in the village square as their sons and husbands were lined up against the church wall. The psychological trauma inflicted by these forced viewings was deliberate. German commanders understood that killing the men was only the beginning of their strategy. By forcing women to witness these executions, they were ensuring that the survivors would carry the trauma for the rest of their lives, serving as living warnings to other communities about the cost of resistance. What made these operations particularly effective was their unpredictability. German forces would strike without warning, often returning to communities they had previously left untouched. This created a constant state of terror among Italian civilians, making normal life impossible and forcing entire communities to focus solely on survival. The pattern was consistent across Italy: encirclement, separation, interrogation, and then systematic elimination. But as the war progressed and German forces found themselves increasingly stretched thin, the methods became even more brutal and the targets more specific. Italian women, already bearing the burden of keeping families and communities together in wartime, now found themselves the primary targets of a campaign designed to break the Italian spirit entirely. As German operations intensified across Italy, something unexpected began to happen. Instead of breaking under the pressure of systematic terror, many Italian women began to fight back. Not with weapons, few had access to firearms, but through a network of resistance that would prove crucial to the eventual Allied victory. The German High Command, had not anticipated the role that Italian women would play in supporting the partisan movement. Their calculations had assumed that targeting male combatants would effectively end resistance activities. They failed to understand that in many Italian communities, women had become the backbone of the resistance infrastructure. Carla Capone was 23 years old when she joined the resistance movement in Rome. A former university student, she had watched German forces occupy her city and decided that passive resistance was not enough. She began by carrying messages between partisan cells, using her ability to move freely through the city as a young woman to avoid the attention that male operatives would have drawn. But Carla's activities soon expanded beyond message carrying. She learned to manufacture explosives, plan ambushes, and coordinate complex operations against German installations. Her gender, which the Germans had assumed made her harmless, became her greatest asset. She could walk past German checkpoints, attend social gatherings frequented by German officers, and gather intelligence that would have been impossible for male operatives to obtain. The German response to women's participation in the resistance was swift and brutal. When they discovered that women were actively supporting partisan operations, they began implementing collective punishment strategies, specifically designed to target female civilians. In the town of Fosse Ardeatine, just outside Rome, the German military command decided to make an example that would deter other women from supporting the resistance. On March 24, 1944, following a partisan attack that killed 33 German soldiers, SS Obersturmbannführer Herbert Kappler ordered the execution of 335 Italian hostages in retaliation. The selection process for these hostages revealed the German strategy for targeting Italian women. While the majority of those executed were men, the Germans also included women who had been identified as resistance supporters. More importantly, they forced the female relatives of the condemned men to be present during the selection process, making them complicit in choosing which family members would live and which would die. Giuliana Benzoni was forced to choose between her husband and her teenage son. Both had been arrested during a roundup of suspected resistance sympathizers. The German commander informed her that her family was permitted to ransom one of them, but she would have to decide which one would be released and which would face execution. The psychological torture of these forced choices was deliberate. German commanders understood that by making women complicit in the selection process, they were ensuring that survivors would carry guilt and trauma that would last for generations. Even if a woman saved one family member, she would spend the rest of her life knowing that her choice had condemned another. But the German strategy backfired. Instead of deterring women from resistance activities, these brutal tactics only increased their determination to fight back. Across Italy, women began organizing more sophisticated resistance networks, using their knowledge of local communities and their ability to move freely to create intelligence-gathering systems that would prove devastating to German operations. In the industrial cities of northern Italy, women workers began organizing sabotage operations in the factories where they were employed. They would deliberately damage machinery, introduce defects into products destined for the German military, and coordinate slowdowns that significantly reduce production of war materials. Maria Faggiani worked in a textile factory in Milan that had been converted to produce uniforms for German soldiers. She organized a group of women workers who began introducing subtle defects into the uniforms they produced: loose buttons, weak seams, improperly sized pieces. The defects were small enough to avoid detection during quality inspections, but significant enough to cause the uniforms to fail under the stress of military use. The German response to industrial sabotage was characteristically brutal. When they discovered evidence of deliberate defects in military supplies, they began implementing collective punishment policies in the factories. Women suspected of sabotage were publicly tortured in front of their co-workers, with the explicit goal of deterring others from similar activities. But even these extreme measures failed to stop the resistance activities. Italian women had reached a point where the fear of punishment was outweighed by their determination to fight back against the occupation. They began developing more sophisticated methods of sabotage, better communication networks, and more effective ways of avoiding detection. The cat-and-mouse game between Italian women resistors and German security forces would continue throughout the occupation, with both sides escalating their tactics and the civilian population caught in the middle paying an increasingly heavy price. The mountainous regions of northern Italy became the epicenter of the most brutal confrontations between German forces and Italian civilians. The terrain, which provided natural hiding places for partisan fighters, also made it impossible for German forces to distinguish between combatants and civilians. In response, they implemented a policy of total warfare that treated every Italian civilian as a potential enemy. The Apennine Mountains, stretching along the spine of Italy, had become a stronghold for partisan groups. These fighters used their knowledge of local terrain to launch hit-and-run attacks against German convoys, communication lines, and isolated outposts. But for every successful partisan operation, German forces extracted a terrible price from the civilian populations that lived in these mountainous communities. In the province of Reggio Emilia, the village of Cervarolo sat nestled in a valley surrounded by dense forests. The location made it an ideal base for partisan operations, but it also made the civilian population extremely vulnerable to German reprisals. On March 20th, 1944, a German patrol was ambushed while traveling through the valley, resulting in the deaths of 7 soldiers. The German response was swift and comprehensive. Rather than pursuing the partisan fighters who had conducted the ambush, they decided to eliminate the civilian infrastructure that made such operations possible. SS Oberfuhrer Max Simon, commanding the 16th SS Panzer Grenadier Division, ordered the complete destruction of Cervarolo and the surrounding villages. Adelma Tagliaferri was 31 years old, mother of 4 children, when the German forces surrounded her village at dawn on March 21st. She had heard the gunfire from the previous day's ambush, but had no connection to the partisan fighters responsible. Like most of the women in the village, her primary concern was keeping her family fed and safe during the chaos of war. The operation that followed was unlike anything previously seen in the Italian campaign. German forces didn't simply execute suspected partisans or destroy military targets. They implemented what they called area denial tactics, designed to make entire regions uninhabitable for both partisans and civilians. Every building in Cervarolo was systematically destroyed. Homes were burned, wells were poisoned, livestock was slaughtered, and crops were destroyed in the fields. The goal was to create dead zones where no human activity could be sustained, forcing any surviving civilians to flee to other regions where they could be more easily monitored and controlled. But the destruction of property was only the beginning. The German forces also implemented systematic elimination of civilians, focusing particularly on women who might be capable of supporting future resistance activities. The criteria for these selections revealed the thoroughness of German planning and the extent to which they viewed Italian women as military threats. Women who were literate were considered dangerous because they might be able to carry written messages between partisan groups. Women who had relatives in other villages were suspected of maintaining communication networks that could be used by the resistance. Women who had demonstrated any kind of leadership in their communities, whether as teachers, nurses, or simply as organizers of community activities, were viewed as potential resistance leaders. The mountain campaigns also introduced new levels of systematic violence that revealed the extent to which German forces viewed Italian women as military targets. Women were not simply killed or forced to witness violence. They became subjects of calculated campaigns designed to destroy their physical and psychological capacity to support resistance activities. In the village of Monchio, nestled high in the Apennine Mountains, German forces implemented what they called pacification procedures that specifically targeted women of reproductive age. These procedures were designed to ensure that communities could not recover their population base, even if some civilians survived the initial operation. The methods employed were designed to create trauma so severe that it would be passed down to future generations, ensuring that Italian mountain communities would never again be capable of supporting resistance activities. By the end of 1944, entire regions of the Italian mountains had been depopulated through these systematic campaigns. Villages that had existed for centuries were reduced to ruins, their populations scattered or eliminated. While the mountain campaigns were capturing international attention, an equally brutal but less visible campaign was being waged in Italy's major cities. Urban warfare presented different challenges for German forces, but their response was no less systematic or cruel. Cities couldn't be destroyed and depopulated like mountain villages, so German commanders developed new tactics specifically designed for urban populations. Rome, Milan, Turin, and Naples became laboratories for urban population control experiments that would influence German tactics throughout occupied Europe. The dense populations, complex social networks, and economic importance of these cities required more sophisticated approaches than the total destruction tactics used in rural areas. In Rome, SS Oberfuhrer Karl Wolff implemented what German planners called selective pressure tactics. Rather than conducting mass roundups that might provoke widespread resistance, German forces began targeting specific segments of the urban population in ways designed to maximize psychological impact while maintaining the functionality of the cities. Italian women in urban areas faced unique vulnerabilities that German planners exploited systematically. Their roles as primary caregivers made them reluctant to flee. Their connections to extended family networks made them valuable intelligence targets, and their participation in the urban economy made them accessible to German surveillance systems. The case of Anna Maria Caglio illustrates the sophisticated nature of urban persecution. Anna was a 34-year-old teacher in Milan who had never participated in resistance activities. Her crime was being married to a man who had fled the city rather than report for forced labor in Germany. German authorities classified her as a military widow, a designation that made her subject to special surveillance and restrictions. Anna was required to report to German authorities twice weekly, providing detailed information about her activities, contacts, and financial situation. She was prohibited from traveling outside her neighborhood without permits, from gathering with more than 2 other women, and from discussing her husband's whereabouts with anyone, including family members. The restrictions were only the beginning of her persecution. German authorities implemented what they called social isolation tactics, designed to break down the support networks that made urban resistance possible. Anna was forbidden from visiting her parents, from speaking with her neighbors about anything other than immediate practical matters, and from participating in religious services where she might encounter other women in similar situations. The psychological pressure of these restrictions was devastating. Anna found herself completely isolated in a city where she had lived her entire life, surrounded by people who were afraid to speak with her because association with a military widow could result in their own persecution. The German authorities had successfully turned her neighbors into instruments of surveillance, creating a web of fear that was self-reinforcing. The urban campaigns also introduced systematic use of economic warfare against Italian women. German authorities understood that women were primarily responsible for managing family finances and obtaining necessities like food, clothing, and medical care. By controlling access to these necessities, they could exercise tremendous pressure on urban populations without the visible brutality of rural operations. Food rationing systems were implemented not simply to manage scarce resources, but as weapons of psychological warfare. Italian women were required to register with German authorities to receive ration cards, providing detailed information about family members, employment, and financial resources. The registration process could take hours or even days, forcing women to stand in lines where German security personnel could observe and document their interactions with other civilians. Carlotta Benzini spent 6 hours every Tuesday standing in line at the German Food Distribution Center in Florence. The wait was deliberately extended. German officials could have processed ration requests much more quickly, but the lengthy lines served multiple purposes. They provided opportunities for German personnel to conduct informal interrogations, to observe which women were associating with each other, and to identify potential resistance supporters based on their behavior and conversations. But the most insidious aspect of the urban food control system was how it turned Italian women against each other. Ration allotments were deliberately set below subsistence levels, forcing women to compete for additional food through various forms of collaboration with German authorities. Women who provided information about their neighbors' activities could receive supplemental rations. Those who reported suspicious behavior could move to faster lines. In Turin, Maria Giordano faced exactly this choice when German authorities offered her family supplemental food rations in exchange for reporting on the activities of other women in her apartment building. Her youngest child was showing signs of malnutrition, and her elderly mother was becoming increasingly weak from inadequate food. The German officer who made the offer was polite, understanding, and patient. Maria's decision to accept the offer haunted her for the rest of her life. The information she provided was minimal and seemingly harmless, but it led to the arrest of a neighbor woman whose son was subsequently executed for partisan activities. The guilt of her choice compounded the trauma of occupation, creating psychological wounds that never fully healed. These urban psychological warfare campaigns were remarkably effective. By the end of 1944, German authorities had successfully broken down most of the informal support networks that had sustained Italian urban populations during the early phases of the occupation. Women were isolated, fearful, and increasingly desperate, making them unlikely to support resistance activities and more willing to collaborate with German authorities. By early 1945, German forces in Italy found themselves in an increasingly desperate situation. Allied armies were advancing from the south, partisan activities had intensified throughout the north, and German resources were stretched thin across multiple fronts. In response, German commanders implemented what they called final phase operations, a last desperate attempt to maintain control through unprecedented levels of violence against Italian civilians. These final phase operations abandoned any pretense of discrimination between combatants and civilians. German commanders issued orders that classified the entire Italian population as hostile, authorizing their troops to use extreme measures against anyone suspected of anti-German activities. For Italian women, who had already endured years of systematic persecution, this final phase would bring new levels of horror. The retreat strategies developed by German forces were specifically designed to leave behind devastated populations that would be incapable of supporting Allied operations. This meant not just destroying infrastructure like bridges, railroads, and industrial facilities, but also eliminating the human resources that would be necessary for post-war recovery. In the Po Valley region of northern Italy, German forces implemented what they called scorched earth policies that went far beyond military necessity. As they retreated northward, they systematically destroyed everything that could support human life, not just military targets, but also agricultural infrastructure, water systems, housing, and medical facilities. But the most devastating aspect of these final phase operations was their specific targeting of Italian women who possessed skills or knowledge that would be valuable for post-war reconstruction. Teachers were systematically eliminated to prevent the re-establishment of educational systems. Nurses and midwives were targeted to disrupt medical care. Women who had demonstrated leadership capabilities in their communities were identified and executed to prevent the emergence of local governance structures. The case of Pierina Gatteschi illustrates the methodical nature of these final targeting operations. Pierina was a 42-year-old elementary school teacher in the small town of Vinça, near La Spezia. She had never participated in resistance activities and had actually complied with all German requirements throughout the occupation. Her crime was possessing the skills and knowledge necessary to help her community recover after the war. On August 24, 1944, as German forces prepared to retreat from the region, SS troops surrounded Vinça with orders to eliminate what they classified as reconstruction threats. These were civilians who possessed skills, education, or leadership experience that might enable rapid recovery of Italian society after German withdrawal. Pierina was identified through German administrative records as a teacher, automatically classifying her as a reconstruction threat, along with 38 other women from the village, including 2 nurses, a midwife, and several women who had served in community organizations. She was selected for execution not because of anything she had done, but because of what she might be able to do after the war. Similar operations were conducted throughout northern Italy as German forces retreated. In village after village, town after town, German forces implemented systematic elimination of civilians who might be capable of post-war leadership. The goal was to ensure that Italian society would be so devastated that it would be incapable of recovery for years or even decades after German withdrawal. These final phase operations also included systematic destruction of cultural and historical artifacts that formed the foundation of Italian identity. Churches were desecrated, libraries were burned, historical monuments were destroyed. German commanders understood that breaking Italian morale required not just physical destruction, but also the elimination of the cultural touchstones that gave meaning to Italian life. For Italian women, who had endured years of systematic persecution, these final weeks brought new depths of suffering. They were forced to watch as everything they had struggled to preserve throughout the occupation, their families, their communities, their cultural heritage, was systematically destroyed by retreating German forces who seemed determined to leave nothing behind but ashes and trauma. When Allied forces finally liberated Italian territories in 1945, They discovered the extent of what German forces had inflicted upon Italian civilian populations. The physical destruction was visible and well documented. Destroyed villages, burned cities, devastated countryside. But the human cost, particularly the systematic trauma inflicted upon Italian women, would take decades to fully understand. The liberation brought an end to the systematic violence, but it could not repair the psychological wounds that had been deliberately inflicted upon an entire generation of Italian women. Many survivors found themselves unable to speak about their experiences, not just because of personal trauma, but because the nature of what they had endured was so far beyond normal human experience that there were no words to describe it. Dr. Alessandro Portelli, who spent decades collecting oral histories from Italian women who survived the German occupation, documented the lasting impact of these systematic campaigns of psychological warfare. His interviews, conducted in the 1960s and 1970s, revealed that many women had never spoken about their wartime experiences, even to their own families. The silence was not simply a matter of personal choice. The trauma inflicted by German forces had been specifically designed to be unspeakable. Women who had been forced to make impossible choices between family members, who had been compelled to participate in the destruction of their own communities, who had witnessed systematic violence against their neighbors, found that their experiences were so far beyond normal human understanding that sharing them felt impossible. The systematic nature of German psychological warfare had created trauma that was designed to be permanent and intergenerational. Children of survivors often reported unexplained fears, anxieties, and behavioral problems that seemed to have no connection to their own experiences, but reflected the unprocessed trauma of their mothers. Economic pressures compounded the psychological trauma. Many Italian women had lost not just family members during the German occupation, but also their means of economic survival. Farms had been destroyed, businesses had been eliminated, and the skills that had previously provided economic security were often no longer relevant in the post-war economy. The combination of psychological trauma and economic desperation created a cycle of poverty and marginalization that affected not just individual women, but entire communities. Villages that had lost significant portions of their adult population struggled to maintain economic viability, forcing survivors to migrate to cities where they often faced discrimination and economic exploitation. The failure to address the psychological aftermath of systematic violence against Italian civilians had consequences that extended far beyond individual suffering. Communities that had been subjected to German psychological warfare campaigns often struggled to rebuild social cohesion and trust, creating long-term problems with civic engagement and social cooperation. For individual women, the effects of wartime trauma often manifested in ways that were not immediately recognized as war-related. Higher rates of depression, anxiety, and physical illness among female survivors were often attributed to other causes, preventing appropriate recognition and treatment of war-related psychological injuries. It wasn't until the 1960s and 1970s that Italian women began breaking their silence about the German occupation. This emergence of testimony coincided with broader social changes, women's liberation movements, and increased psychological awareness. When Francesca Cappelletti finally spoke publicly about her wartime experiences in 1968, she was 73 years old and had never told her own children what happened during the occupation. Her testimony, recorded by researchers at the University of Bologna, described systematic cruelty that had been absent from official histories. Francesca had been forced to watch as German soldiers executed her teenage son for helping an injured partisan fighter. But the execution was designed as psychological warfare against the entire community. The German commander required every woman in the village to be present, forced to stand in the village square and watch the prolonged torture without looking away or making any sound. The psychological impact was devastating not just for Francesca, but for every woman forced to witness. They were all made complicit in the violence, creating guilt and trauma that affected them for life. This shared trauma made the women unlikely to support future resistance activities and served as a permanent warning about defying German authority. Similar testimonies emerged from women across Italy. Elena Marchetti, a nurse in northern Italy, described how German forces turned hospitals into intelligence gathering centers. Medical personnel were required to report on every patient, creating impossible ethical dilemmas between medical duties and personal survival. Many women waited 20 or 30 years before speaking, often coinciding with major life transitions, when they finally felt safe enough to confront their traumatic memories. Even then, their testimonies were often met with skepticism, until German military archives examined in the 1980s and 1990s provided documentary confirmation of the systematic psychological warfare operations. Today, more than 75 years after the end of World War II, the experiences of Italian women during the German occupation are finally receiving historical recognition. Museums and memorials across Italy now include exhibits documenting the civilian experience, with particular attention to the systematic violence directed against women. The Fosse Ardeatine Memorial in Rome and the Sant'Anna di Stazzema Memorial Park in Tuscany stand today not only as places of remembrance, but also as living educational centers. Through carefully curated exhibitions, guided tours, and school programs, they provide critical insight into the devastating impact of systematic violence inflicted upon civilian populations during World War II. These institutions have worked diligently to preserve the testimonies of survivors, particularly women, ensuring that their lived experiences become an integral part of the permanent historical record. By doing so, they help future generations understand both the horrors of state-sponsored violence and the extraordinary strength required to endure it. Among the most enduring legacies of these women's experiences is the powerful lesson they offer about the resilience of the human spirit. In the face of a coordinated and brutal campaign by the German occupying forces aimed at dismantling the very fabric of Italian society, ordinary women bore the weight of extraordinary burdens. Homes were destroyed, families torn apart, and communities shattered. Yet life, remarkably, continued. Despite unimaginable loss and suffering, these women found ways to rebuild what had been taken from them. Villages rose from ruins, community bonds were slowly reknit, and the social trust that totalitarian violence had tried to extinguish was eventually restored. These acts of recovery and resistance speak to the enduring power of human resilience, particularly embodied in the women who carried entire communities forward in the aftermath of destruction. The stories of individual women offer profound insights into the quiet heroism of civilian survival. Women like Carla Capone, who not only survived the violence but chose to continue the fight as a member of the Italian resistance, exemplify courage in the face of overwhelming odds. Maria Faggiani, working under constant threat, organized sabotage operations that disrupted German supply lines and communications, all while protecting her family and neighbors. Elena Ruggieri, who shielded her children from the horrors of the Marzabotto massacre, represents the fierce and instinctive drive to protect life even amidst mass slaughter. These women's stories, once relegated to the margins of historical narratives, now emerge as central accounts of resistance, sacrifice, and endurance. They reveal a form of heroism that does not rely on weapons or uniforms, but rather on moral courage and unshakable determination. Importantly, the violence these women endured was not incidental or accidental. It was part of a calculated strategy of domination and terror. The targeting of Italian women was not a byproduct of war. It was a systematic effort to undermine the cohesion of families, to break the spirit of communities, and to erase the possibility of resistance through fear and humiliation. Recognizing this calculated nature of gendered violence is essential, not only for understanding history accurately, but for applying its lessons to contemporary conflicts. Around the world, civilian populations, especially women and children, continue to be deliberately targeted as a means of psychological warfare. By studying these patterns in the context of World War II Italy, we can develop more effective policies and humanitarian strategies to protect vulnerable populations in today's wars. Perhaps the most inspiring aspect of these women's stories is their eventual decision to speak, to break decades of silence and bring their memories into the public sphere. Surviving systematic persecution is one form of strength. Maintaining one's humanity throughout that suffering is another. But finding the courage to relive those experiences in order to educate others is a profoundly generous act. Through their voices, we gain a deeper understanding of the human cost of war, one that goes beyond statistics and battles to the intimate lived experiences of individuals. Their testimonies, once at risk of being lost to time, now illuminate the darkest chapters of history and help ensure they are never repeated. In honoring these women, not only as victims but as active participants in their own survival and the rebuilding of their communities. We reaffirm the importance of remembrance, education, and resistance. Their lives and stories remain a vital part of our collective conscience, challenging us to confront the true impact of violence and to strive always toward peace, justice, and human dignity. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more history documentaries.